This is consumer equilibrium. When we say equilibrium, we mean there's no tendency to change. We say the consumer has picked a bundle of goods that is the best for the consumer. We don't say why it's the best. We say this is the bundle of goods that the consumer would prefer over any other bundle of goods given their income and their preferences. That's it. So it's consumer equilibrium. They'll never choose another one. They'll get to that point and that's the one they'll choose, is what we say. And we saw that the consumer equilibrium occurs at the tangency of the budget line and the highest indifference curve. And tangency means the slopes are the same. So we saw that it means the exchange of y for x by the consumer equals the exchange of y for x in the marketplace. And we define that, the exchange of y for x for the consumer, as the market rate of substitution. And what defines the exchange of y for x in the marketplace? This is the most important idea, isn't it? America. Negative px over py, the inverse of the price ratios. Everybody? So now, when I ask you what consumer equilibrium is about, those of you who speak more than one language and are well knowledgeable about all sorts of stuff and can do anything, and I'm sure if I asked you about the Real Housewives of this and that or anything else, you'd know all their names and every one of their affairs, right? You'd know all this stuff. I don't expect you'll always remember this. The marginal rate of substitution equals minus px over py. That is consumer equilibrium. That sums up this whole lecture. Don't forget it. It's like MC equals MR. Don't forget it. Okay, now, as long as you're remembering that. Now, it turns out, by the way, just the other day, I never mentioned this again, because we're going to come into the Rod Ford story in a minute again.
Yes.
I was asking, like, I might have mentioned this last day, I'm not really sure because I moved back and forth between the two classes. I don't know if I talked about rationality and economics. The one student I said, like, why do people vote for Rod Ford? Like, there's this new poll. This guy who's a disgrace to the city, disgrace to anything that anything means, has got nothing to say, can't even read. If you voted for him, watch him try to read from his prompter. He can't do it. He literally can't read, you know. He can drive and read, but he can't read of a prompter. But no matter. Why would anyone vote for this guy? It's crazy. He's got no ideas. Cut taxes. Why? That's an idea. You know, be nice. Love people. This is an idea. This is nothing, right? So anyway, the point is, people vote for him. So I said, why do they vote for him? And the guy said, in my psychology course, they gave this answer. And I'm just saying to you, this is, now I don't want to criticize this economics, but all of economics for the last 100 years, up to about 20 years ago, has insisted that people behave rationally. Now, it turns out a lot of economics doesn't actually fit the data out there. And now, in the last 20 years, people are going, hey, wait a minute. We've known this ever since Freud. People don't necessarily behave rationally. All this economics is based on the fact that the individual behaves rationally, figures out their best bundle, and buys it. But it turns out that's one part of the way human beings behave. But sometimes they behave sort of intuitively. They go into a McDonald's and they buy a Big Mac and fries, which is not actually a rational decision, you know, if they want to live a long life and not be sick that night. But basically they do that because it's comfort food and they're used to it and so on and so forth. There's a lot of intuition or just kind of rote, you know, you do this, they vote for Ford because their parents voted for Ford or whatever, you know. So again, no, everything we do is based on the supposition that people are rational. If they're not, it's not perfect. Our theory isn't perfect. So just be aware of it. Okay, now, the thing I really want to get to is this kind of an idea. Let me see here. Right here. I want to get to this. And I want you to follow this logic. I've asked you this before. Here we're going to have the price of X. Go back to demand functions, everybody. We know, what I'm trying to get, and again, I should be able to say to you, how are you going to analyze this question? How would you analyze this question? Ron Ford, at the beginning of his mandate, was elected, and he came up with this scheme that the city should shut down libraries and build Ferris wheels, in particular Ferris wheel on Cherry Beach. This is his idea, right? So that's why I have Ferris wheels in Cherry Beach and libraries in one of my examples. So how would we decide between Ferris wheels as economists and libraries? How would we decide? How would we make that decision? Now listen carefully, because I'm giving you a clue. If both entail, like we can have a new library for $1 million, or we can have a new Ferris wheel for $1 million, which one would the city build according to best economic practice that you guys already know? How would we decide whether to spend $1 million on a library or $1 million on a Ferris wheel? Well, what did we learn? Yeah, behind you, the white. Yes, thank you.
Depending on how many Ferris wheels already exist or how many libraries already exist.
Not really. I mean, that might make sense, but how many libraries that might exist will manifest itself in this particular measure? And what is that measure? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Marginal revenues higher than marginal cost.
Assume that's the same for both of them. I want to know they both cost the same amount. Go ahead, Tom.
The combination where the marginal utility of the next Ferris wheel library equals the next marginal utility of the next Ferris wheel library.
Kind of, you could say that, but the thing is I kind of cooked it because I said they both cost the same amount and we're at equilibrium, right? So at equilibrium, the last person that goes to the library will pay whatever the library is worth, and the last person who goes to the Ferris wheel will pay whatever the Ferris wheel is worth. What is the measure that we use? I talked to you before. How do you decide about going to the bar or the movie or the whatever, given them the same price? How do you decide people? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Consumer utility.
Consumer surplus. All right? So now everybody knows what should have been done is that demand function should have been figured out for libraries. And you might say, well, how do you do that? Well, you can figure it by saying to people, how much more, if we had to shut this library, how much would you be willing to pay as a fee? How many books would you take out if the fee was this, and how many times would you come to the library if it was this? So you can kind of make up a demand function. Everybody? So you could make a demand function for the Ferris wheel. So you make a demand function for both of them. Now watch, I'm going to make those demand functions. And you're going to tell me, now let's just assume the supply for both of them is the same, like this. It's like this, and like this, everybody. And then it turns out this one is libraries, and this one is Ferris wheels. And here's the demand function, which I calculated in the real world, right? I went out and derived the demand function as I talked about with you guys. And this demand function looks like this. And this is the same number of people here, say. Whatever number this is, we're talking about 1,000 people right here at this library. And on this one, here's the Ferris wheel one. It looks like this. And the number of people is the same. And the equilibrium price, I'll just have that, is exactly the same, so it costs the same. Which one do we build? According to the economic theory that we just discussed. The Ferris wheel, right? All right, now back off. Because this turns out to be really important. So you know how to do this. And I expect it, so it would be really nice for me. I'm going to ask you this in an exam, and it's astounding how few people can do it. Figure out the demand function. I can give you some help. Figure out the consumer surplus, make a decision about which to choose, this kind of stuff. It's very practical. But there's a problem. Now Marshall, you remember, we talked about Marshall, taking the principle of diminishing marginal utility, which was useless in the old style because you couldn't measure marginal utility, How did Marshall measure marginal utility to get a demand function? Tell me. You need to be reading my notes and thinking about this. If you think about this, it has meaning. You know, can you imagine discussing the moon and not knowing that, not going out and going, oh, there's the moon. You never look up. Look up. There's a moon out there. Okay, good. How did Marshall measure marginal utility? How many know? Yeesh. Erica, tell me. Yeah, he measured them in money. So I don't know how much he likes oranges. There's no way on earth I can ever figure out his feelings for oranges, but I can figure this out. How much he would pay for an orange. You know, I have an orange here. You want this orange is kind of waving in front of me? And I'll say, I'll give it to you for $50. No. 42, no. 50, no. 60. 12, 9, 6, 4, 3, 22. All right, I'll buy it. Bang. I measured how much he's willing to pay for the orange, right? Now, what the orange sells for is determined by the market. Okay, so Marshall measured the demand function in terms of money. And Marshall recognized that that was a problem. Why was that a problem? Yeah, go ahead. Oh, go ahead, Rose. Did you have an answer? Yeah. Money has diminishing marginal utility. What, you know, like if you guys said, let's go for pizza tonight, $10. For some of you people, maybe all of you, that's an issue. You know, when you graduate, so what? $10 for a pizza, big deal, right? It's not an issue. Small change. I'm always amazed when I'm, selling these packages, and people have to run to get cash. And like $10 is not something they just have on. I mean, who was around for $10? But it's basically that. So Marshall recognized that if you had $1 million, $100 might be worth the same to you as somebody who had $10,000 and had $10, right? Everybody? So now, think about this. The reason that this is a problem is consumer surplus is the way we want to measure things. But consumer surplus is corrupted because the value of money falls. Now we're focusing, and I need you to be thinking. And what Marshall would say is this: you know what? This isn't a true measure. These people are tourists. They come into town, they've got money to spend, they're willing to spend $50 or so on a Ferris wheel, and that's the deal. They're tourists. Here are the usual library patrons. I don't know if you've gone to public libraries that are all over the city. And as I said, that's the #1 library system in North America. You go to these places, there's a lot of elderly people, they have no money. There's a lot of young people, they don't have any money. If you went there, if I said, these are people whose lives revolve around the library and they couldn't spend $10 for a fee. They couldn't. So it turns out, if we were to correct these demand functions by making sure that everybody's dollar, if everybody's dollar was worth the same, correct the rich people, we corrected, they have $1 million, so they would treat $100 the same as someone else would treat $10. If we correct those things, here's what we would have. We would probably have this, a complete reversal. This would be like this, because the money the people have no money, but they could live and die for the library. The Ferris wheel, it's just a bunch of junk. If we corrected it for the money the tourists had, this is what their demand function looks like. So it turns out, actually, we need to be building libraries, not Ferris wheels. Everybody? Now, that is called the income and substitution effect in the modern economic thing. And we have a means of dividing that up and creating what we call the income compensated demand function. So if you were to do this thing as an economic project, you should first of all figure out the demand functions, and then figure out how you can correct the demand functions for the distortion caused by the different distribution of income. Everybody? Then you can use that demand function to compare consumer surplus and make political decisions. All right? That's the idea. And so, enough of that. So I'll just say, finally, if a price changes, it has two effects. It's cheaper than, that good is cheaper than something else. I'll give you this example. I've got $200 to spend on restaurants and movies this month. Movies are $15 and restaurants are $20. It turns out I go to 8 movies, so I spend $120. And I go to 4 restaurants, so I spend another $80. All my money is spent. 8 movies, 4 restaurants. Now suppose the price of movies was to fall to, let us say, $10, all right? Then, in the first place, if my income didn't change at all, because movies are relatively cheaper, I will go to more movies, number one. That's called a substitution effect. But this effect that I'm going to talk about here is the one we want to get rid of. Because when the movie falls to $10, you know what? I have more income. Now if I went to 8 movies, I'd spend $80, which means I saved $60. Right? Something's wrong there. I went to 8, yeah, I saved $40. I would save $40. This is new income. I gained income because the price of movies fell. And I could go to more restaurants and more movies. That's the distinction between the income and substitution. So in my notes at the very end there, we do a theoretical elimination of the income effect to get a proper demand function. You don't have to know what you need to know. Okay, just forget it. But remember I said to you again, the city, I don't know if it was in this class or the other class, it doesn't matter. The other class said this, I can't remember what you guys said. I said, what if the convocation hall was used, the students' council had money to get a group in there. It could be Celine Dion, or it could be, in the other class, I don't know what you guys picked, they picked Snoop Dogg, okay? Or someone told me it's Snoop Lion. But anyway, no matter. And I said to you, hey, this would be Snoop Dogg, but students really like to go to see Snoop Dogg, so the demand would be basically high for that. And this would be Celine Dion at the university, right? So that the council would choose this, having figured out the demand function. But here's the news, people. People who go to see Snoop Dogg don't have any money. Students don't have money. You want to see Snoop Dogg? Were you willing to pay $100 to see him? No. Well, maybe you would be. Too bad you don't have $100. It would mean you would meet for a week, right? But guess what? Here's more news. There's enough people at this university, like older people, slumming around taking a course here and there, who like to fly down to Las Vegas and see something. And if you look at their demand function, because they have lots of money, they would be happy to pay $100. So sorry, students, you're going to be screwed out. So I'm pointing this out to you. Demand functions are what we want to measure, and you know how to measure them. But properly, they should be corrected for the distortion of money, or what we call in the modern sense the income effect, right? And that's enough of that. Now I'm going to move on to the main event of this course, the next 6 lectures. I'm going to ask you to think, and I'm going to mock you, so be ready to think, okay? 10 minutes, we move on.
Well,